Many of you have requested a full ranking video for the entire series, but with the release of Elden Ring, we're just past 175 main bosses in the series, making that a gargantuan task. I may still release that video in the future, but for today, we'll kick the can down the road with a top 10. With the developer and FromSoftware whose bread and butter is creating imaginative bosses of all types, some with unique mechanics, others with slick, action-oriented combat, dueling knight-like swordsmen, to horrific and gruesome monsters and beasts, to majestic, beautiful creatures, boiling this anthology down to 10 is almost impossible. There's simply no way in which I can make this video and not leave out some of your favorite bosses. As there would be too many honorable mentions to name, let me know who you would have included down below. On a quick note, as this channel grows and given that I enjoy a wide variety of games, as do many of you, I'm looking to expand the content a bit while still maintaining our Souls identity, so as a compromise, I may start dropping a midweek video of another genre and keep the weekend to FromSoftware and related games. The first bonus video would be on the bosses of Metroid Dread, possibly this coming Wednesday, time permitting of course. I'm also currently playing Salt and Sanctuary for the first time and loving it, by the way, in preparation for the sequel, Salt and Sacrifice, that comes out on May 10th, so I'll probably drop a video in relation to that as well. As for this entry, I almost look at this video as a love letter to FromSoftware bosses in general and really wanted to appreciate the full collection over the years, so I chose no more than 2 bosses per game in order to stop the list from skewing too heavily into any one specific title. For anyone new to the series, this will include Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and of course Elden Ring. So without further ado, let's jump in. Number 10, Fume Knight. Dark Souls 2 has a variety of top-notch bosses, from the Beast and Sin the Slumbering Dragon, to the epic encounter with the Burnt Ivory King, some of the best storytelling in the series, to the wonderful Dark Magician in Dark Lurker. Not to mention Looking Glass Knight and of course the legendary Sauron. But we kick off this list with Raim, one of Drangleick's most distinguished knights as denoted by his soul item. The aesthetic alone almost grants him top 10 status, as his blacked out armor with a straight sword in his right hand and ultra great sword in his left make him one of the most badass, intimidating bosses in the series. The combat itself is well balanced for a difficult DLC boss, as he rains down a number of melee attacks with combinations arising from each weapon. Once he's had enough of the player's nonsense, he two-hands and buffs his greatsword with fire and even mixes in some pyro-like attacks, adding to the fight's anxiety. In all honesty, the soundtrack doesn't particularly stand out to me in terms of the series as a whole, but it's more than adequate to accompany the encounter. A bit of a tragic figure, Raim and Velstadt were known as the left and right arms of the king until their wills clashed and Raim was deemed a traitor, as told to us by the rebels' Great Shield. I want to leave this entry with the following from the legendary Fume Ultra Greatsword, mostly because it just sounds badass. The exile swordsman Raim had the ability to expunge the black fog, but chose to live alongside it in the company of the Child of Dark that haunts the world. Number 9, Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. An overwhelming fan favorite, I would have feared for my life had I not included her in this video. In all seriousness though, she nails every facet of what makes an amazing boss. Iconic cutscene? Check. Tells a story? Nailed it. Amazing soundtrack? Yep. Fantastic combat in both close and distant quarters that escalates through multiple perfectly timed phases? Absolutely. Never mind that she looks like a total badass and wields a legendary armament in the Rikuyo, which originated in the same country as the Cainhurst Chikage, but demanded dexterity rather than blood, the reason Lady Maria was fond of the trick weapon, as she frowned upon blood blades. While a divisive subject, it's impossible to not mention that Lady Maria would probably despise rivers of blood spammers. However, in a selfless act, perhaps desperate to stop you from discovering the secrets of the fishing hamlet, Lady Maria succumbs to the practice she so hates in soaking her blades in blood for Phase 2, and even culminates in buffing them into a fiery blaze for Phase 3. The music delightfully accompanies this high-stakes dance of death as you duel in elegant combat across the arena, reminiscent of a dojo or ballroom floor, majestically gliding and trading blows. Probably the best mono-e-mono fight in the series against an opponent of similar stature. Number 8, Godfrey, First Elden Lord / Horaloo. This was probably the most difficult choice to make, as Elden Ring is still so fresh, and even though the game is only 2 months old, with 200 hours of playtime already, it feels like it's been out for a full year. Elden Ring has so many top quality bosses, from Moog to Morgott, the formidable swordswoman Melania, the fitting finale of Radagon and Elden Beast, fan favorites Starscourge Radahn and Dragon Lord Placidusax, the magical wonder of Renala, and the spectacle of Rykard. With the wide variety and differing opinions, it's difficult to label one standing out completely above and beyond the others, as they are all spectacular in different ways. But the more I play, the more Godfrey, First Elden Lord / Hoarah stands out as a boss that may stand the test of time. He checks all of the boxes of an iconic boss, hosting a fantastic soundtrack with memorable chanting and horns. He's a prominently featured character who you fight in the climax of the game under the main Erdtree, has a badass mid-fight cutscene, and really well-tuned combat. Plus, his visual aesthetic and godlike attire with a lion over his shoulder just exudes legendary warrior status. I'll admit Phase 2 will probably be hit or miss depending on the player, but Phase 1 is fantastic, as dodging the combination of his massive axe and earth stomps feels smooth and satisfying. The AoE of his volcanic eruption attacks may draw the ire of some, but I'm fine with a boss at this point having a couple of moves that push the limits of your skill. As I mentioned, Phase 2 is going to be more debatable, but FromSoftware wouldn't be who they are if they didn't take chances, as this part of the fight seemingly was developed with inspiration from Street Fighter or Tekken. I should mention Godfrey, originally wed to Queen Marika, led the war against the giants, but once his purpose was fulfilled, was exiled from the lands between, making him the first Tarnished. Number 7. Sister Fried and Father Ariandel. Narrowing down Dark Souls 3 bosses to a couple of selections is nearly an impossible task, as many would argue it has the best assortment of combatants in the series. So no matter who is chosen, some fantastic entries are gonna be left out. That being said, Sister Fried is an excellent representative of Dark Souls 3, a boss of 3 distinct phases, each increasing in difficulty, as following an introductory cutscene, we meet her on adversarial terms for the first time in a clever way to start the fight. I'll admit it took me a decent amount of time to get accustomed to her disappearing act in Phase 1. But other than her major critical gliding attack, most of her offense is fairly straightforward, and it's Phase 2 where the battle really begins, as Father Ariandel rises, still strapped into his chair, which I maintain is one of the more silly visuals in the series, but nonetheless provides Ember to Sister Fried to initiate an action-packed Phase 2, where Fried can now heal the father. However, being strapped to the chair, as mentioned, he has minimal defense when being outflanked or attacked from the rear. Then comes the genius decision to award the player a Titanite slab following Phase 2's conclusion, as more players than would probably admit fell for this being the conclusion to the battle. The perfectly paced, steady crescendo from introductory Phase 1 to dual opponent Phase 2 to Sister Fried going Super Saiyan for Phase 3 is what takes this fight from great to a classic, and as FromSoftware has mastered at times, the soundtrack syncs with and follows these transitions perfectly. Sister Fried's Phase 3 is masterfully tuned to be overwhelming and aggressive enough to take you to peak anxiety and cloud your decision-making, but can be overcome with practice and perseverance, giving the player an elated sense of accomplishment. Fried was the first Ashe to enter the painting, but together with the good father, they chose Rot over Fire according to her soul item. I bet her and Melania would be a good brawl, come to think of it. Number 6, Dragon Slayer Ornstein and Executioner Smo. The most iconic duo in the entire series, these legendary warriors are the climax of a classic area in the mythical Anor Londo and more than do justice to the fabled city. From an aesthetic standpoint, it's hard to forget these two given the dichotomous nature of Ornstein's athletic Olympian physique and our more burly friend in Smo, as well as their Dragon Slayer spear and hammer respectively. On top of their unforgettable presence in dazzling golden armor announced in a classic cutscene, they are supported by a memorable soundtrack, most notably filled with a section of booming orchestral horns. The OST exudes an ornate palatial feeling that suits Anor Londo to a T. Many fights have gone on to borrow heavily from this encounter, with the obvious being Phase 2 of Sister Fried and Father Ariandel, as well as straight up trying to replicate it in the Godskin duo. The original combat is fantastically paced, with Ornstein's range, spear, lightning, and quickness, or Smo's sheer size, covering so much ground. One of them is always creating pressure, but especially with the arena's pillars, it rarely feels like an all-out gank. In yet another classic cutscene, the surviving member of the duo buffs with the power of their fallen brother, resulting in a giant version of themselves in a really fun Phase 2, an amazing encounter with the captain of Gwyn's 4 knights as noted by Ornstein's armor and Smo, who unfortunately ruined his chances of being a knight of Gwyn due to grinding the bones of his victims into his own feed. Honorable mention, Tower Knight. Originally, I was trying to force a Demon Souls boss into the list for the sake of each of the 7 games having a representative, but my heart couldn't convince my mind that it contained one of the 10 best bosses in the series, so we're gonna cheat the system and slot in Tower Knight as an honorable mention so I can talk about Demon Souls. I could have chosen any number of bosses here, from Old King Allant or the Penetrator, who each provide excellent combat, to Maiden Astraea for her lore and soundtrack, or perhaps even Flame Lurker for his action and difficulty, or even the cinematic nature of Storm King. While it isn't everything, a portion of what gives a boss quality for me is how memorable they are, and Tower Knight is one of the more instantly recognizable in the series, with the beauty of the design being in its simplicity. The design of the character model itself isn't totally unique, as he's simply a massive oversized knight, but his enormous shield and lance combined with his magic suits the medieval fantasy world of Demon Souls perfectly. Part of what makes Souls games great is conquering foes that look insurmountable at first, but have weak spots to find and exploit. Obviously, the fight doesn't have the intricate combat of a Lady Maria or a Nameless King, but this encounter evokes the childhood-like imagination of storming a castle and conquering a larger-than-life magical knight in a David versus Goliath encounter, along with the classic archers raining down arrows on the arena. Not to mention his timeless soundtrack that I'm sure exudes nostalgia for Demon Souls veterans. It's nostalgic to me, and I still haven't even played the original. I should mention the Tower Knight is a member of the Round Table of Boletaria and the corrupted form of Alfred, whose red phantom we find in 1-4 just after defeating the Penetrator. As I mentioned, you could have chosen a few bosses, but for me, Tower Knight exemplifies the medieval fantasy of Demon Souls. Number 5, Owl Father. It's very difficult to compare Sekiro bosses with others in the series, as the mechanics are so uniquely specific when contrasted with the Soulsborne entries. While some may say the combat is limited, this streamlined system allowed for precise balancing and fine-tuning of some simply amazing encounters. Owl Father exemplifies this gameplay as one of the many shining encounters in the game, with constant back-and-forth action utilizing a variety of attacks requiring pinpoint counters in this flowing masterpiece. Quite a heartbreaking, complicated encounter as you duel to the death with your foster father, who pulled a young Sekiro from the battlefield and raised him as a shinobi. While differences in moral code now divide the two characters, as you deal the final blow, Owl laughs and says, "Defeated by my own son. The feeling is not entirely unpleasant." Surrounded by carvings of Buddha in this secret underground temple with pillars of flame, this final duel for Owl is held in one of the best arenas in the series, accompanied by an exquisite soundtrack, but as with many Sekiro bosses, the slick action-packed combat is what sets Owl Father apart, as you must deflect and avoid his massive katana, usage of firecrackers, and most memorably, the ethereal owl spirit he summons in Phase 2. Oh, by the way, he can Makuri counter you, which is pretty terrifying. A fight that exemplifies the rhythmic back-and-forth struggle for the upper hand in this brilliant game. Number 4, Knight Artorias. There are a handful of warriors you could point to, but Knight Artorias is certainly one of the most iconic characters in the entire series. When putting together these rankings, you have to account for the time period in a way, and remember, Artorias debuted in 2011. Similar to when the greatest athlete of any given sport is debated, a player from the 1950s is usually compared to their peers at the time, and their influence on future generations is taken into account. Yes, there are bosses that feel mechanically smoother to fight and have a wider variety of slick moves, but I think it's important to give credit to the originals that spawned the later fights, as other than Gwyn, Artorias is really the only sword-based humanoid fight in the game, with Demon Souls only containing Penetrator and King Allant. This style of fight has produced many fan favorites, including Sir Alon, Burnt Ivory King, and obviously the Abyss Watchers. Of course, none of this is to say Knight Artorias isn't still a fantastic duel in 2022, as he certainly still holds his own, and as a common theme on this list is replete with an iconic opening cutscene that of course is an ode to Penetrator. Not to mention his fight takes place in about the coolest location you could possibly duel, in a massive coliseum. Torn and battered from trying to repel the encroaching abyss, we face a decrepit version of Artorias, who, while still formidable, we can only imagine him in his prime. A soundtrack that isn't overpowering probably suits the sullen nature of the tragic hero in this classic encounter. Number 3, Ludwig the Accursed/Holy Blade. A lot of life is defined by memorable moments, and many would point to the cutscene revelation of the iconic Holy Moonlight Sword in Ludwig's phase transition as perhaps the best in the series. For a series synonymous with outrageously amazing soundtracks, Ludwig's theme may be the pinnacle of them all. There are countless OSTs you could point to, but the emotion this one evokes and the journey it takes you on, along with how it complements the fight as the music seemingly aligns with the combat, ebbing and flowing on all the right beats and notes. The combat is really a story of two halves, as Ludwig behaves as a rampaging beast in Phase 1, but pulls back enough as to not be as jittering and sporadic as the Royal Remnants in Elden Ring. His melee attacks have enough side-to-side action as well as rear defense to guard against the tried and true smack that booty method of attack. While he may be a little rambunctious for some, he provides ample time for healing and recovery. Phase 2 is where the real magic happens, and the fight is taken to a whole nother level as the gargantuan Ludwig rises and rains down a symphony of beautiful attacks that sync at times perfectly with the soundtrack as the beautiful green lights contrast with the blood-soaked battlefield. It's interesting that Ludwig is one of only a couple of beasts to retain his cognitive function after his transformation, concluding the demise upon defeat by inquiring of the outcome of his fellow church hunters. Number 2, Ishin the Sword Saint. When I think about Ishin the Sword Saint, one word comes to mind: flawless. Perhaps the most finely tuned, perfectly balanced boss FromSoftware has ever created. Every move this man performs was examined with a microscope, a fine-toothed comb, and delicately placed into the game with tweezers. A crumbling Genichiro way of Tomoe acts as the prelude to this encounter, as he was born a peasant and raised by Ashina after his mother's death. Having strayed into heretical arts to save the land he loves, his dying wish is to preserve his falling nation, calling his grandfather, Ishin, from beyond the grave to grant it, as one who returns from the great beyond does so at peak of their prosperity. Ishin coveted strength and all manner of techniques throughout his mortal struggle. He wished for war until his final hour, and that is precisely what he got. The intricate combat perfectly encapsulates and tests every bit of skill you've obtained on your journey. As the 3 phases progress, Ishin amps up his range of attacks as he wields Genichiro's katana, General Tamura's spear, and famously a Glock, with his arsenal increasing in variety of patterns, which we will discuss more in-depthly in a future video, as I'm looking to put together a top 10 most difficult Souls bosses video in the near future. In continuing, the term atmosphere gets generically thrown around a lot when describing bosses, and I'm guilty of it myself. But my god, if there was ever a time to label a fight as having outstanding atmosphere, this would be that time. The beautiful moonlit cliffside of Ashina, delicately covered by silvergrass with a thunderstorm crashing down, is perfection. While Sekiro isn't known per se for uniquely memorable OSTs, they aren't bad by any means, and this one's frenetic pace builds nicely and pulls back at the right moments, holding the player's anticipation, anxiety, and excitement perfectly. Just the complete package and everything you hope a final boss of a masterpiece like Sekiro would be. A+ 10 out of 10. Number 1, Slave Knight Gale. With countless masterpieces developed over the years, a number of bosses could have been slotted in here, but for today, Gale takes the crown as the best boss FromSoftware has ever produced. He is a boss that exemplifies the notion of stern but fair in taking a mammoth effort to master, but not being insurmountable. A common theme in this list: bosses that take you to your absolute limit and you swear are complete BS while you are continuously dying, but it's a feeling that totally subsides upon overcoming the odds, as at the moment of defeat you feel like a god and the genius of the boss you just conquered comes flooding in. You could argue for a couple, but I think a lot of people consider Slave Knight Gale the de facto boss of the Dark Souls trilogy. The red-hooded wandering slave knight Gale sought the blood of the Dark Soul as pigment of the painted world, but Gale knew he was no champion, that the Dark Soul would likely ruin him, and that he had little hope of a safe return. As says in his soul item, and the blood of the Dark Soul that seeped from the hole within Slave Knight Gale, used as pigment by his lady in Aryan Dell to depict a painted world. When Gale came upon the Pygmy Lords, he discovered that their blood had long ago dried, and so consumed the Dark Soul. As with many others on this list, Gale hits every note. Classic opening cutscene a la Penetrator and Knight Artorias, as well as a heavy mid-fight cutscene, epic soundtrack that fits the perfect backdrop that truly feels like you're fighting a legendary figure at the end of the world. While Phase 1 has some fun combat in its own right, as dodging and mastering Gale's slashes is quite satisfying, Phase 2 may be some of the best action combat FromSoftware has ever designed. Gale perfectly combines the use of his repeating crossbow, casts Way of the White Corona, summons lightning, and of course his full array of greatsword attacks, which, by the way, is one of the most fun weapons in the game to use. He even releases a soul-like cast of skulls, which also adorn around his cape as he twirls and slashes, forcing the player into pinpoint timing. Just the perfectly tuned balance of a variety of attacks, but enough of a telegraphed window and space are provided for a legendary back and forth encounter. If there's a way FromSoftware could have designed Gale any better, I'm not sure what it is. A truly legendary foe, and my pick for the best boss in this amazing series. As I mentioned, look out for a video possibly on Wednesday covering the Metroid Dread bosses, as well as a Salt and Sanctuary video soon, as the sequel Salt and Sacrifice is coming out on May 10th. Until then, I'll probably be streaming Elden Ring this weekend here on YouTube, probably around 2 p.m. Eastern US if anyone wants to drop by. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope to see you around.
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.